Alrighty, thanks Dan. So thanks all for coming. Today we're going to talk about a topic which I'm fairly passionate about, which is building flexible displays in an elegant and maintainable way. First up for the intros, Dan already stole my thunder, but this screenshot is outdated. I just turned 8 on Drupal. I work for Previous Next. I was previously, before that, working with the Department of Justice and Regulation in Victoria, and before that with Catalyst IT, both in Melbourne and New Zealand. So, what are we going to talk about today? We'll first cover component-based design, what it is, and what the benefits are to using component-based design. The problem with implementing component-based design in Drupal, and how I've sort of solved it on several recent projects. So, what is component-based design? It's sort of the idea of taking your UI, breaking it up into more manageable and distinct components. You can give each of those components a clear name. But the idea is, I won't go into too much detail, but the idea is that, the things are broken down into their smallest parts, and then you kind of compose those parts back together to create the whole design, page, or whatever. At the end of these slides, there's a really good blog post about explaining more of this in depth, but for now, we'll just go through an example. So let's say we start with the most basic thing, maybe a paragraph of text. This will have, in your styling, you might have a font family, a weight, a size, and all of that kind of thing. You might have a heading element with that, and that's got various styling associated with it. You might have an image that's got a certain aspect ratio and sizing around that kind of thing. And then you could group those three things into another component. Maybe it's got a background image. Maybe you call that a promo item. And maybe you want to replicate that promo item into a 4-column grid. And building up a component library from a very small few pieces of things into a larger library. Zooming out, we might have something like this as a part of a page. You've got a sort of hero banner, that promo sort of item down here, maybe a list of media releases up the top, and maybe a video and some other text. So what's the problem with implementing these sort of things? Well, traditionally with these kind of designs, these kind of component-based designs, clients want to have full flexibility over a page or a section of a page, and they want to be able to tailor that section to suit their needs on a page-by-page basis. So this might mean moving an item around and replacing an item with a completely different item. It might mean changing a component's number of columns or how many things are in a component, that sort of thing. And so why is this a problem? Well, it can become a nightmare for editors. Maybe if you're implementing this using the paragraphs module, you might have come across things like nested paragraphs for rows and columns, and then you have to have all your components nested inside of those, and you very quickly end up with a ginormous dependency chain, and it just becomes hell to change any of that stuff. And then that leads to maybe performance issues, much less flexibility. You can't drag things around between rows anymore, that sort of thing. And secondly, theming becomes really hard, at least in the traditional sense, which is what we're going to hopefully solve in this talk. With so many components and so many options of those components, maybe different ways of customizing them, it becomes tricky to pass all those options down to the theming layer and have that nice flow and effect. So I said that traditional sense, right? That's easy. We just pre-process all this stuff into our templates and we're good to go. Nope, no, we really don't want to do that anymore. We've all seen and done things like this, and I'm kind of here to tell you that we don't really need to do this anymore. You know, it can be, this can be good for some sort of things, you know, pre-processing small things into bits and pieces that you otherwise can't customize, but we really don't need to do that anymore. So why change? Well, with this model, components with small number of options and complexity become extremely complex. You know, end up with a massive number of templates. Recent example I saw had 3 field templates, 2 paragraph templates, and over 100 lines of pre-processing logic just for one fairly simple component. That becomes really difficult to maintain, obviously. What template do I change? Where am I going to find this pre-processing logic? Things might be scattered between your theme and your custom modules. And it's really hard to reuse any of that code because all the templates and everything are then tied to your field name, your field type, your paragraph. In this instance, if we're building components with paragraphs. But that's not to say you can't, as I said, there are some situations where you need to pre-process or it's just easier to do that. But remember, we're going for a composition of components. We want to be able to reuse all those smaller ones and build them up into a larger, more complex one. And then we want to be able to reuse all that theming work that we've done in those larger components. Cool. Sorry. So, what is the solution to all this? There's a few things. Firstly, using the layouts. So, I'm not going to cover layout builder as there are some problems with it playing nicely with common moderation tools like Workbench and content moderation. I'm just going to talk about layouts in the terms of using the layout discovery module in core, but a lot of these kind of layout concepts that I'll cover shortly can be applied to layout builder, and you just swap around a few things, like you'd use blocks probably instead of paragraphs. Secondly, display suite and plugins. So you can implement custom display suite plugins, and they're really nice. We'll have a look at those. And also custom field formatters. So we'll start with layouts. So this is an example of a content type, just the content region of a content type using a layout. So we can break this layout into regions. So we've got a heading at the top, metadata, featured image, the main content of the page. So this might have all those other components that we talked about before, that we had examples of before, sorry. The tags, and then the pagination down the bottom. So layouts are really good for I find them better for high-level structures like content types. You can use them for lower-level components, but I find that field formatters are much easier to work with in that sense. So that definition of that layout we just saw, this is the YAML that you'd use. Just drop this into a layouts.yaml file in your theme, and then implement this template, and you'd be good to go. And this is using nothing but layout discovery module in core. And what does that look like in the manage display section? Just like this, you've just got all your regions mapped out for you. And as a nice little segue to the next section of the talk, this is actually a display suite plugin right here. So that metadata region that you saw on the screenshot is this display suite plugin. So, display suite plugins. This is the layout, like I said. This little piece is actually a display suite plugin. And these are really good for combining different fields on the same entity and formatting them in, you know, a little custom way. These are good to be able to reuse across different view modes. So like if you've got the same thing on a different view mode, you can just plop that display suite plugin on that view mode and you're good to go. So, you know, we've got things like custom text and icon. We're pulling out the created date of that node and formatting it in a custom way, and then pulling out a field from the node author, the user entity, and linking to that as well. It's actually linking to a custom route as well. And then we're reusing that same display suite plugin on a teaser view mode and, for example, like a summary list page. Cool. So that's a display suite plugin in a nutshell. So moving on to custom field formatters. So for this example, we're going to look at an accordion component. So one of those things that opens and closes when you click on it, and it has a title and it has content underneath it. So this is my accordion component. It's got several fields. So it's got the main accordions field. This is the main thing we want to render. And then the other things are options for that component to customize how it functions. So a heading style. So lots of clients like to change, you know, H2, H3, H4 in the list to keep nice semantic headings. The layout style, which we'll come back to a bit later, but this is essentially applying like a Flexbox class to the component itself. And a Boolean checkbox to say, should this accordion have its first item open by default? So these are, you know, a few options. You could have many more. And these are examples of things that we don't want to have to pre-process onto the component. So as I said, the only thing we want to render is that accordions field. So we write a formatter. So we actually start with a theme hook, or two theme hooks in this case. We've got the wrapper accordion theme hook, which will be our sort of container for the accordion. That has a bunch of items in it, and those items happen to be accordion items, which we also define our own theme hook for. Then we have the formatter itself. So the guts of the formatter is the view elements function. So when you implement the formatter plugin, you'll implement the view elements function. And here we're just getting all those options from that parent accordion. And then we're looping over remember this is a formatter for the accordion field, we're looping over each of the accordion entities and rendering those accordions into our custom theme function. And then we are returning that wrapper accordion that we mentioned earlier. So the templates for that look like this, just really quickly. You can see that there's no like fieldy stuff in here. It's all just plain twig. We're attaching the theme through here. I really like to do it. I find it is nice to declare what your template is relying on in the theme from the actual template rather than the render array that's calling it. That's just my personal preference. But, oh my goodness, sorry. But the great thing about this, as I said, this is shippable anywhere else, right? This isn't tied to that field formatter. We've just implemented some theming functions and then used our formatter to populate these templates through that. So what's really nice about this approach is the more complex the component, the more benefits you're going to see with this. That accordion example there is pretty simple, but as you start to build a more complex component library, you might implement that promo item, for example, that we saw earlier, and maybe that promo item appears in a completely different component which is not related to your paragraphs at all, and you've got to then, you know, in a traditional sense, you'd have to re-implement all that theming for something different, but in doing it this way, you can just plug everything in to those theming functions. and you'll be good to go. So the cherry on top of all of this is something called Flexbox and a module called entity class formatter, which was one of those fields that I showed that I had earlier. So I'm not going to pretend that I'm a front-end developer in the slightest, but Flexbox is a grid or layout system. It's really good for having components that sit next to each other as siblings, and means you don't have to nest grid items or set widths for components if you want. You can have components expanding to fill their space. You can have flexible rows, like a 3-column followed by a 2-column followed by a full width. And it means you can have your listed paragraphs, imagine in your node edit screen, just all as siblings of one another, and they all just decide how many columns they all take up with a setting on the paragraph. So that would look like something like this. You've got this layout style field, and that allows editors to choose the column width. And then your configuration for that field is just a key value pair of class to friendly name. And that's the entity class formatter module then takes that key and automatically applies it as a class on the wrapper entity when it renders. So really easy. Cool. So we've covered quite a bit. And I couldn't really have done this presentation without a bunch of cheesy animations. So this is all the stuff we covered. And if you combine all these techniques and architect your site, and with all these techniques that we've talked about, you're going to make yourself and your developers and your clients, your users, as happy as this guy. Cool, so there's if you want to look at these slides later, here's a module list of stuff I use and other helpful modules as well. Some links as well. There's my blog post from about a year ago on this topic. Ricky's blog post about more of the front-end side of this. The component-based design blog post, and we're going into more detail about that. And some example sites where we've previous Next have implemented this kind of thing. And that's it. Anyone got questions? I just picked the worst ones possible. Oh yeah, it's my dog. Yeah, that's why I have so many photos of him.